Are you in Indianapolis?
Just outside of him.
Okay, yeah. I think maybe we talked about this. My roommate from college lived in Carmel.
Oh,
Yeah, yeah. So I've been there a couple times to visit her.
Oh, very cool.
Yeah.
Go visit the former vice president if you so desire. He's
Oh,
hanging his hat there right now.
Quill? Dan Quill, is it?
Well, Quayle's here,
Oh,
but
oh,
no,
oh, Pence.
uh,
Pence. Yeah.
and haven't stopped by with a plate of cookies or anything as of yet.
Oh gosh. Oh gosh. I know. It's just all such a loaded topic for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
It's just not. I used to like to talk about politics, and now I'm like, I can't even. I just.
I'm sure it never comes up with your novels.
Oh, well, it's kind of. I mean, it's what I like is, especially during War of 1812, of realizing how bad off we were politically, and we came through that. And it's an era that most people don't even know about. Like they don't know that. I mean, the division was much deeper than it is now, and it's an era in our history that we don't even think about. And if we came through that, we could come through this, hopefully.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah, yeah.
And what's the alternative?
I know, but it
Yeah,
is, it's, because obviously we know about the Civil War. People are much more interested in the Civil War, I think, and the Revolutionary War than the War of 1812. But it's like we almost lost our country completely, and it came so close. And most people don't even know. I mean, I didn't know until I started researching it. I had no idea how dire things really were. So it was kind of refreshing, and that was the time of duels. And people were dueling on in the Hall of Representatives, and when war was declared in the War of 1812, like the whole northern states went into mourning, and they hung their flags at half-mast, and they closed their schools, they closed their shops, they tolled funeral bells. So meanwhile, the southern states and the western states were like having a huge party. They were having parades, they were having fireworks. I mean, it was just absolute opposite reactions, and just like complete and total division. So it's just kind of amazing that by the end of the war that we all pulled together, and the war itself created a sense of nationalism that we didn't have before. So it's very inspiring.
So, I mean, it's like, I don't know, is that silver lining type stuff, or do we look at that as part of the process of how we got to where we are? Not necessarily because that has to be the process, but it simply was.
It simply was. It was just something we had to live through, because when we look at James Madison, he was sworn in 1809, and we were only 20 years old then. George Washington was sworn in 1789. So if we think back, now that we're in 2022, which is mind-boggling in itself, if we think back to 20 years ago, 2002, that our president then was George W. Bush, and our favorite TV show was Friends. And if we try to grasp the concept of what if our country just started in 2002, like it just shows how young our country was at that point, that we had won the war, we had won the peace, but we didn't really know what to do with it. We knew we didn't want to be a monarchy, but we didn't really know what that meant. And we had Thomas Jefferson answering the door as president, looking like a farmer and holes in his slippers because he didn't want to appear monarchical, but we didn't really have any traditions. We didn't have a sense of Americanness. I mean, even back then, people would say the United States are. They wouldn't say the United States is, because it was so regional. Everybody identified by their individual state much more than as an American. And it was at the end of the War of 1812 that people started to say the United States is, that we were unified enough to have that single identity as one, which, I mean, that just gives me the chills every time I think about it. Just how our sense of nationalism arose basically because from the ashes of Washington City, that even these Federalists who had opposed the war so vehemently at the start were so outraged by the British marching in and burning down all of our public buildings that all of a sudden everyone was united against the British, and everybody dug in for the Battle of Baltimore, and people poured in from all over the country, all ages, shapes, genders, sizes, and worked around the clock for 2 weeks until the British invaded there and were able to push them back. So people that And even Francis Scott Key, he was a distant cousin of Dolly Madison's, and he's the one who wrote our national anthem, Star Spangled Banner. And he was a Federalist. At the beginning of the war, he called the war an abominable lump of wickedness. And there he is watching the Battle of Baltimore, and he's the one writing the land of the free and the home of the brave. And it's just like, he's such a perfect example of how public opinion changed really overnight with the burning of Washington City. So so now it's like, when I hear the anthem, I just have, there's so much more to it than what the average American knows. So it's neat to understand the background of it, because he was basically on a British ship. He was trying to free an American prisoner who was on there, and the British said, sure, you can take him, but you can't leave till after the battle. You're going to have to sit here and on the deck and watch, and he's going to be below decks. We can't let you leave now because you both have seen and heard way too much. So that's why he had the front row seat to the battle, and then basically scribbled down the poem on, just loose pieces of paper that he was able to find. And then they printed up on broadbills, and then it became hugely popular, and it was set to the tune of a popular drinking song at the time. So I'm not sure if that's the same tune that it is now. I think it's a different one, but yeah, it's
sure it would arouse folks in a pub later on in the evening. It's a nice tune.
Yeah, but yeah, imagining the drunken people trying to hit those high notes, that's a little scary.
Well, anybody who's been to a ball game doesn't have to imagine that. I don't think.
True. Yeah.
that is an American tradition. I think that is proudly carried on.
That's a very good point.
Well, I think we should call this the start of the show. We're into it. So Libby McNamee is my guest. Hi there, esteemed audience. Welcome to another episode of Little Great Ninja. Happy to have you with us. And we're talking about all kinds of stuff. We're talking about your book, Dolley Madison and the War of 1812. So when we're talking about a topic as big and as far-ranging as the War of 1812, it sounds like there's no end to the number of subjects you could dig into and the rabbit holes you could go down. Why Dolley Madison?
Oh gosh, Dolly Madison, because she really changed our country, and she was such a force of good during the War of 1812 when there was such division. And Dolly was raised as a Quaker, and when she married Madison, she was kicked out of the Society of Friends. They decided they no longer wanted to be friends with Dolly after that. But she always had this, her upbringing of believing in the inner light in people. And I can imagine it was probably very challenging to find the inner light of some people, but she always was the one to turn the other cheek and be kind. And when I do talks with kids, I always say, can you guess what her superpower was? And, she could, send fire through her, fingers or whatever. And then I say, it's kindness. And her kindness was very disarming. So she would approach all of these Federalists who despised her husband and continually be kind. And she would have all these social events as a way to get people together, to get people to talk to each other, so that if they became friends and had some sense of cordial relationship, then they could actually have a non-heated discussion about policy initiatives. So when Dolly moved into the White House, it was basically empty. It was just a total disaster, really. There was no lawn, there was no gate, there was no steps, there was basically no furniture. The John and Abigail Adams only lived there for 4 months when they lived in the president's house. So they really hadn't bothered to decorate or anything. And then Jefferson moved in, and he wanted to spend his money on getting a good roof and buying floor coverings and things for the kitchen. So he brought all his furniture from Monticello. And then when he left the presidency, he took it with him, understandably so. But Dolly was basically faced with this empty house that was in total disarray with, there was just paint drippings on the wall. It was just a total disaster. So Madison was an introvert, she was an extrovert, and he said, well, that's okay. Mr. Jefferson didn't really entertain, because Jefferson was another one who was an introvert. And Dolly said, oh, no, we are not, we are definitely entertaining. And she basically forced Speaker of the House, Henry Clay, to come in, and the people who controlled the purse strings, and shamed them of saying, the British are tossing us around like a cat with a dead mouse, and the French as well. And if we don't have a sense of a sense of grandeur, then we are not getting any respect from them, and we're not getting any respect for our people. So basically, she shamed them. She got $5,000, decorated the president's house, and then she started to advertise these parties in the newspaper. And they were called Mrs. Madison's Wednesday Nights, and they were from 3 to 5 in the afternoon. And they were such a hit that they would go until midnight. And the Federalists would come because basically they had nothing else to do, because Washington City had literally nothing there. There were these grand boulevards with no buildings on them, and then there were areas where there were buildings. So they called it streets. What's it? Streets with no buildings and buildings with no streets is what people would make fun of Washington City for. And so when Dolly and James first moved to Washington City, when Madison was Secretary of State for Jefferson, their address was 6 buildings, Washington City. That was it. I mean, because it was the one place where there were 6 buildings together. So what Dolly did by creating this beautiful place at the president's house for a place for people to congregate, that the Federalists showed up, because even they really had nowhere to live. They couldn't bring their families because there were no buildings. They lived in these dilapidated boarding houses put up by the Capitol, and they had roommates, and they would fight about politics. And the only way to get away from your roommate was to go to the outhouse. So the Federalists came to these Wednesday night gatherings, and they became so popular, and so many people squeezed in, they became known as squeezes, and they didn't need to put the ad in the paper. And Dolly included the women, which was revolutionary back then. She included the ladies were invited, and the coachmen. So not only is Henry Clay invited, but his coachman is invited as well. So what she did was try to create this American identity that we all belong, that the president's house belongs to all of us. But she wanted a sense of grandeur, but she wanted to take the elitism and the exclusion away that a monarchy creates. So she would get all these people together, and she would orchestrate with Madison. Well, who would you like to speak with tonight? Because Madison was 5'4", 100 pounds soaking wet, and he was not a looker. He was called once a shriveled apple John, and I don't know exactly what that means, but it wasn't a compliment.
Doesn't sound flattering.
Yes, not flattering at all. So he was very happy to be swept over in the corner, and he had one black suit. And then Dolly was, belle of the ball, and she would wear these, wonderful French gowns that, like what Queen Josephine was wearing, Empress Josephine, and these turbans on her head. And people would just flock to her like a rock star. But she would have this plan at the beginning of the night of who Madison wanted to talk to, and she would escort those people over to Madison. And he would get basically more work done at these parties than he did at his desk all day of having these power players together. And if she saw any hint of trouble or disagreement, she would just send cake and whiskey punch over to them, or go over and inquire about their grandchildren and smooth things over. So she really was the driving force of getting these the Republicans, no affiliation with the Republican Party today, but they were called the Republicans, and the Federalists actually talking together, and instead of basically just arguing. So she was really a driving force that brought people together. And of course, during the burning of Washington City, she was one of the very last to leave and saved the portrait of George Washington. And people absolutely loved her. Like the headlines, back when women's names were not even mentioned in a newspaper, her name was headlines. And it was, the spirit of a nation is roused by Dolley Madison. And I mean, she really is, if there's one person who really pulled us through the War of 1812, it was Dolley Madison. And not to discredit Mr. Madison, because he was phenomenal, but their star power together, they call them Washington's first power couple, was amazing. And because, as we know, as a president, you need to also have appeal people need to like you, and people tend to support candidates who they like, even if their politics are different. And she was so likable across the board. And he was the workhorse, you know, and he was the one getting everything done. So together they just made this formidable team. And it actually, what funny quote, and then I'll stop talking and let you talk.
No, you're good.
But the first time Madison ran for president, he ran against Charles Pinckney from South Carolina. When Charles Pinckney lost, he said, I lost to Mr. and Mrs. Madison. I would have stood a better chance had I run against Mr. Madison alone.
I love this idea that during the party, group is getting a little bit, maybe a little raucous, a little out of control. She's like, oh, send over whiskey punch. That should calm the situation.
Right. Yeah. And she would just, you know, oh, you know, I heard your wife is sick, or that kind of thing. I mean, she would just walk around at these parties and she would try to put everyone at ease, and like every, you know, whether it was the coachman or, you know, a big political figure, she would walk around and introduce herself. And she had this parrot, Polly, this pet parrot. She would walk around with Polly on her shoulder, and Polly,
who are listening instead of watching, Libby should put a parrot on her shoulder.
Yeah, green is a big, huge green macaw parrot. It was a gift from a South American diplomat, but it was an icebreaker, because people who would see Dolly, they would be just absolute tongue-tied, like it was like they'd seen Mick Jagger or something. I mean, she was such a rock star before there were rock stars that people would get completely tongue-tied. So she would walk around with Polly, and Polly was very colorful in her language. The French maitre d' would teach Polly naughty French swear words to say, and but she would also walk around with a copy of Don Quixote or Pride and Prejudice, and then she would use that as a conversation piece. That those were two very popular novels then. And if people, she would say, oh, have you read this? And if someone said, oh, no, I haven't, she'd say, oh, don't worry, I haven't read it either. But if the person said they had read it, then she would discuss it with them, because she had actually read the novels. But she always put herself in other people's shoes, and always showed kindness to whoever it was. And part of it, I think, was her very humble upbringing, that she was, because she grew up poor, so she could relate to people of all, you know, all different parts of society. And just everybody loved her. Everybody loved Dolly. And Henry Clay even said that to her at one point. He said, everyone loves Mrs. Madison. And, you know, she kind of blushed, and she said, that's because Mrs. Madison loves everybody.
So she grew up poor and outside all of this, where do you think, where did, because I encountered a phrase reading about your book that I hadn't encountered it. I don't think I've encountered elsewhere, is charm offensive. She was launching charm offensive during the war. Where do you think she got the skills that she needed to do this and pull this off?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, I think a lot of it was just how just her personality, but she was one of, I think it was 7 kids, and she had 2 sisters, and they were all very gregarious, the 3 of them. So they used to call them the Merry Wives of Windsor, the three sisters. And so Dolly grew up in Virginia, in Scotchtown. She was a distant cousin of Patrick Henry, in Hanover County, Virginia. And then when the Revolutionary War ended, her parents freed their slaves, because Quakers did not believe in slavery. Then they moved to Philadelphia, and her father opened up a starch business. And I remember first reading it and thinking, that does not sound very lucrative, a starch business. Well, it wasn't, and he went bankrupt. In the Society of Friends, that's considered a disapproval from God. And he was cast out of the Society of Friends and was devastated. And he went to bed for 2 years, and he died of depression. And so there they were in downtown Philadelphia, and his wife, Dolly's mother, had no choice but to open up the house as a boarding house. And at that point, Philadelphia was the capital of the United States, while Washington City was being constructed. So they took in all these senators and congressmen, and one of their boarders was Aaron Burr. And but when Dolly's father was dying, he asked her to marry this young Quaker lawyer, John Todd, and she did marry him. They were very happy together. They had a newborn boy and they had a toddler boy. And then in 1793, the yellow fever epidemic swept through Philadelphia, just devastating the population. And her husband and her newborn died on the same day. So there she was, 25. She's got a toddler boy and she's beautiful and just radiates joy and kindness, just her personality. So she was the most sought after woman in Philadelphia at that point. And nowadays, it probably, if you were 25 years old and you had a 2-year-old son, it might not, it might affect your dating possibilities. But back in those days, life expectancy was so much shorter that she was very much sought after. And James Madison saw her on the street and was just awestruck by her. And he asked his friend Aaron Burr to introduce them. So, and the rest, as they say, is history. So
that was the last time Aaron Burr ever interfered in U.S. history. That was it.
So she and Madison got married within a few months. So I'm sure at that point, people were saying, Dolly, Payne, Todd, she's dating who, she married who, like of all these suitors, she would pick this basically, dweeby James Madison to marry, but she did. And they were very happy together. They were very, like she said, our hearts understand each other. And, there's some debate about whether or not she kind of married him at first as like a good provider for her son, that, she said that her 2-year-old son loved him and was hanging on his suit right away. And, she knew he was a very good man, but he was 42 years old. He was 17 years older. He was already an established founding father, and he was a sitting congressman from Virginia, father of the Bill of Rights, father of the Constitution. And here she is, this 25-year-old Quaker. And then she was cast out of the church for marrying a non-Quaker, for marrying Madison. And that's, she was very happy about, because she could cast off this, wearing these, the simple Quaker dress, the plain gray dress. All of a sudden she could wear all this lovely, vibrant colors and have these, have a grandiose wardrobe. And then she started wearing all these turbans and jewelry. And so she loved that. So that's her passion for fashion really came out. And I think it was part because she was repressed her whole life from dressing with any flair at all, that then she just really, and she married someone with money. So she had money to buy all these lovely clothes. And so she would order these fashion dolls from Paris, and she would get in the mail a little doll, and the doll would be wearing whatever the popular dress of the day was in Paris. So then she would get the doll and she would give it to her seamstress and say, will you please make me this dress in my size? And so she was always on the cutting edge of fashion. She would always have like the newest dress from Paris. And Madison didn't mind, but I mean, he just wore he had one black suit that he would wear every day. And, it worked for them. He didn't mind the bills that were coming in.
Well, it sounds like he must have been tremendously relieved if that wasn't a part of thing he enjoyed so very much. And now he's got Dolly, who's sucking all the oxygen out of the room, but in a good way, because she's entertaining the huge crowd and he can get away with who it is he directly needs to speak to and influence, right?
Right. Yeah. Because I mean, he would rather sit home in front of a roaring fire with his Greek and Latin tomes. I mean, that, he was a total introvert, but such a hard worker. I mean, he was so thorough. He would, before he made a decision on anything, he'd read, 20 treatises on it, and, just very, very scholarly, spoke 6 languages. He went to Princeton, and, but it was really neat of a marriage where you really have these two opposites coming together, instead of picking at each other and saying, Jemmy, why aren't you more social? And him saying, why aren't you more academic? That they appreciated the gifts that the other had to offer and work together as such a team. It was a really neat relationship. But people, people would say a lot of nasty things about them, and like during the campaign of, that she was actually having an affair with Thomas Jefferson, and that, all kinds of kind of sexual commentary that, they just chose to ignore. because they never actually had children together. So I assume that Madison was always a very sickly person from birth. Like he never really expected to live into, way into adulthood. And basically what they think now is he had like epilepsy and he had all kinds of digestive problems. So, so he was just this little scrawny guy, and she was, 5'8", very voluptuous, very like Rubenesque, and, towered over him really. But they were good with it. And
We've seen how badly our female politicians are treated in the press now. When we're talking back when they didn't even mention women in the paper, so I can't even imagine all the slander that must have been out there facing her.
Yes,
and probably people directly to her face there in her parties. I mean, I'm sure you don't want to be too rude if there's only 6 buildings and you don't want to get cast out. Where else what other party are you going to go to? But I imagine there had to have been just tremendous rudeness directed right at her. Was there any truth to some of these rumors? Do you think that she did have suitors outside of Mr. Madison?
No, I honestly, I don't think they're true at all. I think it was just, people just being mean-spirited and jealous. And there was a woman, Rosalie Calvert, and she had come over from Belgium during the Great Terror, and she actually lived in Maryland right over the line. And like she hated Jefferson. She called him Tommy Jeff, and then she called Dolly Queen Dalla Lala. So I mean, there's always going to be people that aren't going to like someone. All of us, I've heard that 10% of people, there's 10% of people in the world that I'm not going to like right away. And there's 10% of people in the world who aren't going to like me right away. And that's just a given. But
I think I'm above average on both.
I know that I told that to a friend. She's like, do you think it's that low? Like, well, but Dolly was just very good at, like, if people were rude to her, she just kind of ignored it. And she would always take the high road, and she would just kind of keep on and keep on and keep on. And she would approach, especially these Federalist congressmen's wives, and she would call on them, and she would invite them over to the president's house for these, what she called dove parties. And she'd serve, sardine toast and these lovely bouillons and cakes and all of that. And she would just chip away at these people. And finally, they just couldn't resist her charm, and they would eventually become friends with her. And then she would be able to say, well, this is why my husband believes this. And she would try to explain it to the wives, hoping that the wives would go back and explain Madison's policy beliefs to their husbands. So she just would continually turn the other cheek when people were rude to her. And just amazing. But yeah, I can only imagine at these Wednesday night soirees that she had of people, and I incorporated that into the novel, of her overhearing people saying like horribly rude things about her and Madison, and her just choosing to ignore it. And but it was kind of fun to imagine what was going on in her mind of like, I'd love to slap this woman, and then she doesn't act on it. But as a human, it's to open your house to these people, and then there they are bad-mouthing your husband and talking about what a little grumpy sourpuss he is over in the corner. And I just can't. Or people that her husband's done all these political favors for, or congressmen's wives that she would call on the minute they moved to Washington City and didn't know anyone, and she would introduce them to everyone. And then the woman, the wife would turn on her and be saying these nasty things behind her back. And I can't imagine how frustrating and hurtful it must have been for her. But she just kept on and was very effective. I mean, after she passed away, everything was Dolley Madison brand. I mean, Dolley Madison, lumber, Dolley Madison shoes, Dolley Madison everything, because everybody loved Dolly. And like Dolley Madison cupcakes is the predecessor to Hostess cupcakes that we have today. It was originally called Dolley Madison cupcakes.
Oh, really?
Yeah, neat little trivia. But yeah, it's because she was so well liked across the political spectrum. Like her funeral was the largest in American history. the president closed the federal government that day, and the president gave the eulogy. So Zachary
Still
Taylor.
the largest funeral, or just the largest funeral at the time?
Yeah, the largest funeral at the time, up to that time. But, you know, they closed the federal government that day. And that's when the president in the eulogy, I always mess this up. It's if it's Polk or if it's Zachary Taylor, who was president. But he called her the first lady of the land. And that's where the term first lady came from, was used in reference to Dolly. So that's why on the book and the subtitle, I have it America's First Lady, because she's technically America's first lady, because the term was coined in her honor, even though she was not the first wife of a president. But you know, she, you know, people called her Queen Dolly. She was the first woman put on a stamp. She was she laid the first cornerstone of the Washington Monument. She, what else? She was the only private citizen given a seat in Congress. So when she would go to Congress, you know, in her old age, and if she was late, she would make them start all over again, and they would start all over again. And I mean, she just was a character. They called her friend of 11 presidents, because after Madison passed away, or after when Madison left office, they went back to Montpelier, and 20 years later, Madison passed away. And then she moved to Washington City. She moved to Lafayette Square, and all of the presidents, before they were sworn in, had to go get her permission before they were sworn in. So everyone called it the Little White House. And she was called friend to 11 presidents, because she basically knew every president through her life, you know, from George Washington on. So one of her sisters married George Washington's nephew, but he passed away. And then that sister married a Supreme Court justice from Kentucky. And then her other sister was married to a congressman from Massachusetts. So they kind of all ended up in the whole, you know, political arena, because of, you know, dating all the way back to the boarding house, of meeting all these people in Philadelphia when they were young. So yeah, so she and her sisters were very, very, very close. But alcoholism ran in their family, and basically, I think she had 3 brothers, and I think basically all 3 of them died of alcoholism. And her son, Payne, who lived up to his name truly, he was a Payne. He was the 2-year-old. The newborn son died in 1793, and the 2-year-old survived Payne. And he was very spoiled. Dolly and James both spoiled him, coddled him, and he basically drove them into bankruptcy, financial ruin. She ended up having to sell Montpelier. Madison was paying these huge gambling bills and womanizing and drinking and you name it, buying artwork. And Madison would just pay off all her bills and all of his bills. And it wasn't until Madison passed away that Dolly realized what a financial mess she was in, and that she was bankrupt. And she basically was thrown back into the poverty of her youth once again. And she left, and then she still would make excuses for her son, and, oh, he struggles so. And so she moved to Washington City, to Lafayette Square, and left the son to drive Montpelier into the ground. And he did, and she had to sell it. But so she was wearing clothes that were 20 years old from the presidency, and some of her former slaves were bringing her groceries. I mean, she had no money at all. And Congress felt sorry for her, and they enacted some, they bought some of Madison's papers from her, because at that point there was no presidential pension or anything like that. So but they even put in it, when they bought the papers from her, they put in there a stipulation that Payne could not have access to these funds, because everybody knew how horrible he was. So he ended up in like debtor's prison. I mean, he really, I mean, I hate to speak so badly of someone, but there really was nothing redeeming about him. It was really a shame. Very sad, because she always felt sorry for him, that he had lost his father and his brother. And then Madison was, you know, he was his adoptive father, and he, you know, so he felt bad for Dolly, so he just played along with it. And you know, so Payne was just very, very spoiled. And it was, yeah, very sad.
Well, I mean, I don't know him, but I imagine that's obviously neither do you.
Yeah.
Neither of us have met him. But I imagine it has to be difficult to grow up. I mean, that's a child of a celebrity, right?
Right. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's a pattern you see in, in history of, yeah, it's, but it's a shame. It's like he had all these opportunities. He, like Madison, even arranged for him to go on the peace delegation over in Belgium and go along on that. And then he was just out carousing all night long. And, kind of all those rumors came wafting back. And, I mean, it is a shame. But it's, he basically never really heard no in his life. And it didn't help him any in the long run. But yeah, I it's a difficult situation for all of them. Yeah, but she was very close to, she had some nieces, some of her sister's daughters she was very close to. So they always had, even during the presidency, they had her sister, who the widowed sister lived with them with her 3 kids, and the other sister just lived right down the street. So the house was always full of children. But they for high school they sent Payne. He went to a boarding school up in Baltimore, but, and then he didn't do very well in his studies, didn't apply himself very well, and kind of the whole scene. So that was a shame. I know that was a source of great sadness for her.
Well, hopefully, I was going to say something needlessly mean to a current celebrity child, and I'm not gonna. I'm gonna be better and rise above that. Instead, I'm going to go back and ask about something you had we kind of blew by earlier, but that was that at a time when women aren't even mentioned in the paper, Dolly has the insight to bring women to the party. What prompted that, and what was the advantage of that?
Well, I think part of it is she loved to socialize with women and she enjoyed it, but she also, I think, believed that the men would behave better if the women were there. And that, because at that point she's would be worried about having duels in the White House and the president's house, because there were going to be the foreign ministers from Great Britain and France and all the other countries there. But I mean, there were literally duels on the floor of the Hall of Representatives. So for that was a legitimate worry. But also part of it was she really wanted to cultivate this national identity, and she really wanted people to feel like we're all Americans and we all own the president's house, and it belongs to all of us. So even with all her redecorating, she only redecorated the 3 front rooms that were on display for everyone. She didn't do her own bedroom. She didn't do any of the, the back quarters at all. So she really was a visionary. She really was able to see the big picture and used all of her creative energy in creating this national identity. And like, she started the Easter roll that they still have at the White House. She started really the formality of having the New Year's receptions at the White House. She started the having the band play Hail to the Chief when the president walks in the room, because people were making fun of Madison because he was so tiny. He wore this little like hat with a cockade on, his commander-in-chief hat, and he's this tiny little guy, and people were making fun of him. And so she started, whenever they had a dinner party, she would have the band play Hail to the Chief when he walked in, trying to garner support for him as commander-in-chief. So she just really had a gift for like seeing how people perceive our sense of Americanness and what people need. And that was part of the reason she didn't want to leave Washington City, and she didn't want to leave the president's house when the British were coming in and everyone else is evacuating. And she was one of the very last to leave, because she knew how bad it would look that the president's wife was fleeing too, and that how horrible that would be for morale. And even staying even later of realizing that the portrait of President George Washington was still hanging on the wall, that I don't care if I even get caught, but we can't let that portrait get into the hands of the British and have them parading it through the streets of London, and that would be devastating for American morale. So she really just had such a good read on people and knew what would draw people together and what would motivate them. So, I mean, her timing in history is really amazing. That she came along really at the perfect time where, we had this country, but we didn't have any of the traditions. We didn't have any, we were so afraid of appearing like a monarchy that we were kind of going the other way. And then she said, okay, we can have nice things and not come across as a monarchy. Like, for example, she didn't wear diamonds. She stopped wearing diamonds and all of those, fine stones because she did not want to come across as a queen. She's the one who started wearing pearls. She's the one who made pearls what they are today. She started that whole style trend of wearing pearls, but it was kind of her way of casting off these things that, because people did call her Queen Dolly, but that was not an image that she really wanted to cultivate. So there was a lot going on up there. I mean, she was really brilliant in her, Madison was brilliant and she was brilliant in different ways that really complemented each other.
So for a esteemed audience who's watching or listening to us, you don't have a script in front of you. All of this is extemporaneous that you're carrying around in your mind. You've written an entire first-person present tense account from Dolley Madison. How do you go about doing the research that you need to do? How do you put yourself in that mindset?
Well, I actually, since it's technically a children's book, although lots of adults have read it and enjoyed it, I start off a lot with really simple, like I start with like Wikipedia and I start with children's books, and because I really didn't know that much about Dolly Madison or the War of 1812. And then I basically just start collecting books, and I'm a nerd with the Amazon package thumps on the front steps, and I go down and tear open the plastic bag. But I do that, and like I went to Montpelier a bunch of times. I did a special Dolly Madison tour there. I've met and made a wonderful friend in Boston. She has a business called History at Play, and she does, with the pandemic, she does all sorts of different portrayals of little known yet important American women, but like she portrays Dolly Madison. So I've seen that. And I actually saw a woman who portrayed Suki, who was Dolly Madison's enslaved servant. But a lot of it was fun of just traveling around, going to Montpelier. There's also a James Madison Museum in Orange that I went to and got a speeding ticket on the way there. So be careful when you're in Orange, Virginia. There's a big speed trap.
You were very excited to get there.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. So that's a great museum. And so I visited the Octagon House up in Washington City, where Dolly and James moved into after the president's house was burned down. So that was really neat. They have a sign in front of it, and it's got a picture of Madison, and it says, it's 1812. Do you know where your president is? And so that's just a block or two from the White House. So, and then I had the opportunity to go into the White House, and I got to see a picture of George Washington's huge portrait on the East Room of the White House, where same place where Teddy Roosevelt's kids would roller skate. And I think the Lyndon Johnson's daughter got married in that room as well. But then they have a portrait of Dolly Madison in next door in the parlor. Of course, this is a new building because they had to rebuild the building, but her parlor was right next to the East Room. So they put the portrait, the Gilbert Stuart portrait of Dolly, they put it over the through the doorway. So basically, they have the Dolly Madison portrait where she can look over the portrait of George Washington and keep an eye on it. So that's just a little history geek humor of the way they positioned the painting, whoever, had a good sense of humor. So yeah, I love to be able to do the exploration and go out and actually go to these places and talk to people. And like the researchers at Montpelier were very, very helpful. Hope Hicks gave me some of her papers that she's written and was really helpful. So, and so it's fun to read the books, and the Dolley Madison papers are online through UVA, and you can also order a book with her letters in it, and the books are all quoted. But it was neat because, with the Revolutionary War, there's so much information when I was researching for my first book, but the character of my first book, Susanna Bolling, there was very little information about her. And then this was kind of the flip side is, there's not quite as much about the War of 1812, but there were, volumes and volumes and volumes about Dolly. So that was kind of neat. But but I love just, collecting all the books, and even there's even a like a PBS documentary about Dolly that I watched on TV. But I mean, I think the book would make such a great movie. And the War of 1812 is so exciting. We haven't even talked about the Battle of New Orleans. I mean, that was just like unbelievable. That would just make such a phenomenal movie. So it was neat of just kind of, just reading and traveling around, just all kinds of day trips, and then finding other history geeks along the way. I've got now a really good friend. His name is Kyle Jenks, and he does an interpretation of James Madison, and he's phenomenal. So I met him at a group called History Camp. It was before the pandemic. So he lives in Philadelphia, but I've also met another interpreter there's another interpreter at Monticello, I'm sorry, at Montpelier, who does an excellent job as well. But so it's fun to kind of, the history geeks you meet along the way really make it a lot of fun. So another friend I met, she's done, her group it's called Digital Yarbs, YARBS, but she's made these portraits, like basically 3D, like facial portraits of Madison. She's a big fan of Madison as well. And I'm probably not using the right lingo for it. It's life mask. And so she's created these different life masks. So she's another one, really neat person. And so even like yesterday we were emailing. And so that's been really, really fun, just with all of the whole, writer's journey of, like yesterday I sent copies of Dolley Madison and the War of 1812 off to Mount Vernon. And that was like the best feeling in the world, to send that off on George Washington's birthday to Mount Vernon. And I've got it in it in Colonial Williamsburg and lots of other places. So I've spoken to lots and lots of different groups. I mean, in addition to schools, I've spoken to lots of Daughters of the American Revolution group, Sons of the American Revolution, all kinds of historical societies. And it's really fun because it's just this, love of our country and love of history that unites us. And to have these friends that are, that ostensibly you'd look on paper and think, oh, you have nothing in common. And yet now they're really good friends. And, nobody cares what kind of car you drive or what neighborhood you live in, or, any of the kind of suburban things that people get caught up in. It's just neat to have this whole like different kind of friendship based on shared interests. So I feel very lucky to have even, to be part of this, to be on this podcast. It's just wonderful to kind of share the, my passion for history that I didn't really discover till I was in my 40s when I first started writing my first book. So people always ask me, oh, were you a history major and this and that? And I'm like, no, I thought history was boring. I used to go to Colonial Williamsburg and I'd go to the outlets, and my husband would laugh and say, there's a whole other part of Colonial Williamsburg. And I'm like, yeah. And now I go there and I don't even go to the outlets. So that's why I like writing in the middle grade genre, and kind of, geared to kind of the 12-year-old, of trying to introduce them to history, that history can be fun and exciting and entertaining. It's not necessarily just dates and places and boring facts to memorize, that it's stories about people, quirky people. And so I'd love to inspire them, so that I wish I had started as a historian when I was 12, instead of discovering my love for history in my 40s. So that's why I love trying to get them excited about history.
Now you were a U.S. Army JAG officer in Korea and Bosnia, Germany, and Washington State. So
Yeah.
you must have had at least a sense of patriotism, I imagine. And if you didn't, I'm sure they gave you one once you enlisted.
Yeah, I mean, my parents very I grew up in Massachusetts in the Boston area, but my parents are very patriotic. And so that was definitely instilled in me at a young age. But a lot of it was my desire. I love to travel. And at that point, I was coming out of law school and I really did not want to just like park myself at a law firm and just, I went to school in Washington, D.C. and I just wanted to get out while I was young and single and travel. And so that was definitely part of my motivation for joining the Army, was doing the far-flung travel to go. I was like, why don't I go live in Korea for a year? Why not? And I got to spend a summer in Germany, and then I was at Fort Lewis outside of Seattle for 4 years, and and then Club Med Bosnia for 6 months in the mud pit. So it was a good experience, but I was in about 5.5 years, and then I was like, okay, I'm good. I'm ready to be a normal citizen. But I definitely wouldn't trade those experiences for the world. It's definitely, I just think it's at that age, it's just so good to get out and travel, whether young people want to come back to where they grew up afterwards, but it's just good to take a few years and just live somewhere else and learn, force yourself to be exposed to different cultures and just different ways of doing things. And it just makes you grow so much as a person. And I miss traveling now. But I mean, because back in the times of James and Dolly Madison, I mean, travel was very difficult. Like the Battle of Baltimore, or the Battle of New Orleans, Louisiana was our newest state, and no one had been there. I mean, that's what was one of the most shocking things, is like when the Battle of New Orleans started to take place, no one had been to Louisiana because they had no roads, because it was all those bayous and swamps, and because there were so many Native Americans on the route there, it was very dangerous. And then if you went by ship, you had to go all the way down around Florida, and there were lots of pirates. So the fact that we admitted these states into our nation that no one had been to, and Louisiana, they spoke French. I mean, so when the whole war came down to the Battle of New Orleans, I mean, all these people in Washington City must have been thinking, oh my gosh, our country rests in the hands of these people, and are they really even Americans? Like, do they really even care? Are they really going to fight for us? They don't even speak the same language. And, Andrew Jackson, just amazing, declared martial law, got everybody's guns, hunting guns, drafted all the men folk, and, pulled together these, French aristocrats, Spanish aristocrats, Creoles, Cajuns, privateers, pirates, the rednecks from Kentucky that he had brought in with me from Kentucky and Tennessee. And, he had free blacks, and he got them all together, trained them up, and they whipped the British in 30 minutes. This is the same British army that defeated Napoleon, and the same British army that burned Washington City down. And Andrew Jackson got this ragtag motley crew together, and like within half an hour, he had killed 5 or 6 of the generals. The commanding general of the battle, the British, he was killed right off his horse. And apparently the whole field was just covered in red, and it wasn't blood, it was red uniforms. And absolutely amazing. And I mean, that's something I really did not know anything. I mean, I'd heard of the Battle of New Orleans. I knew it was Andrew Jackson, but I didn't really know how spectacular it was. And that's what paved the way for him to become president, that he was a national hero. And same with William Henry Harrison, became president later on. So even though we don't focus much on the War of 1812, it really was a breeding ground for a lot of our future leaders, Henry Clay, John C. Calhoun, John Quincy Adams, all that, like they were the young guys, and, Madison and Monroe, they were the old guys. So it's I love that, with the kind of you have these two different eras kind of meshing together. So the era, once Madison left, and, you know, that was really one of the most peaceful times in our country's history. They called it the era of good feelings when Monroe came in. So everybody hated Madison when the, after the burning of Washington City. As much as they loved Dolley, they hated Madison. And then once the Battle of New Orleans happened, and everything, and the peace treaty came from Belgium, and the war ended, all of a sudden everyone loved Madison, and that was the era of good feelings. And Monroe walked in, he was like, you know, piece of cake. You know, Madison, when he came into office, he inherited, you know, this country on the brink of war, so divided, and Monroe walked in, and it was like, you know, it was all tied up in a nice little bow for him, for Monroe. So it just, you know, it's just every president has their challenges or lack of challenges. Yeah, so that was the last. So the Monroe was the last of what they call the Virginia dynasty of presidents. Because after that, I think after Monroe, it was, then there was the big kerfuffle where John Quincy Adams ended up becoming president, and it was the big, you know, where Andrew Jackson actually had more votes than, he had more votes than John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay. But I think it was Henry Clay. Yeah, that's an era I need to study more. But basically, that was very divisive because
we're hearing previews of what your third book might be about, or are you
studying
something else?
Oh, my third book, I'm working on it right now. It's, if you could really see my office, you'd see I'm hard at work. I am working on a book on Elizabeth Van Lew, who was a Union spy in Richmond during the Civil War. And she was a high society woman, one of the wealthiest women, but she was anti-slavery from the very beginning. Her family had come from the North, but she organized this incredible spy ring and reported to General Grant, and Grant called her the most valuable spy that he had in Richmond during the war. And at the end of the war, when he first came to Richmond, Grant, the first thing he did was come and have tea at Elizabeth Van Lew's house. And but people hated her. I mean, she was reviled. Poor woman. I mean, it was like dangerous for her to leave her house after the war, because people had suspected her all along, but they didn't really know. They couldn't quite pin her on it. And there was also a lot of respect given to her because of her aristocratic standing in society. So people were so angry because they realized they'd been duped, that she really had been a spy all along. So Grant ended up making her postmistress of Richmond, which back then was like a very coveted spot. So she had that slot for 8 years. But then after that, she, you know, she was persona non grata after that. But so she's quite a legend in the Richmond area. And so I'm starting off, you know, with Fort Sumter and Virginia secession, and then moving in. She started taking care of Union prisoners of war, because basically the Richmond women were only interested in helping the wounded Confederate soldiers. So she started helping the Union soldiers, the prisoners of war there. And then kind of one thing led to another, and then ended up developing this spy ring and, you know, secret messages, because she would go to the jail and she would get information from the newly apprehended soldiers. She would get, you know, she used all sorts of things. Like she would bring food, and she had a secret drawer in her custard dish, and they could exchange notes, and she would give them a book to read, and she would pinprick under certain letters and send them a message. And then she would get the book back a few days later, and they would have returned a message using the same pin, that kind of thing. So, you know, and then delivering messages, she had like 5 different relay points to get it to General Grant, and, you know, using the lemon juice and all that kind of stuff. So I think kids will really enjoy that. You know, all the different spy techniques and all that stuff. So it's interesting trying to figure out who the players were, because of course it was secret. of who the players were in the spy ring and all that. So I actually just went over the weekend. I went to Shockoe Hill Cemetery where she was buried, and she was so poor. Another one, kind of like Dolley Madison, she spent all her money on helping people. She would buy slaves, like slaves who worked for her. She would buy their relatives so they wouldn't be sold down south to keep the families together. But she died very poor. But one of the soldiers she helped was Colonel Paul Revere. So he was Paul Revere's, I think it was must have been great grandson that she helped during the war. So it was his family and some wealthy Boston families that actually paid for her gravestone. I could email you some pictures. I just took them the other day. It was really neat. I haven't started posting things on social media yet because I know it's going to take me a couple of years to write this book. So I'm kind of pacing myself, but it's really interesting. Just learning about all the ins and outs of the Civil War, and that people even in the South weren't, some people were like, the South Carolinians were really hardcore. When they seceded, it was like unanimous. Like Virginia, you seceded 9 months later, and it was basically only after Fort Sumter and only after Lincoln had called up asking for troops to put down the insurrection in South Carolina. And then finally Virginia seceded. But so it's interesting to just see, there was just such a wide range of views. Whereas I feel like what we think, oh, Confederate bad, North good, and that everyone in the South was pro-slavery, and realizing that, like everything, there's so many nuances, and I mean, just coming across these crazy facts. Like I was just talking about this with my James Madison friend Kyle Jenks last night, that during the Civil War, if you lived in the South and you owned more than 24 slaves, you were exempt from serving in the military. So most of these people that were actually fighting for the Confederacy didn't even own slaves. And a lot of it was the media kind of ginning everything up in the South. Like they were like, oh, Lincoln's coming down, he's going to invade, they're going to rape all our women, they're going to, they're trying to destroy our way of life. And so these, uneducated white men are thinking, well, I got to do this. I got to do this to protect my family. They're going to come down here and they're going to, the war of Northern aggression. And it's really sad. Just like, I feel like a lot of people were duped, and, and a lot of people, even like Lee, it's like he really did not believe in slavery and all of that, but he wanted to stand with Virginia, and so much of that. But I'm just realizing now in Virginia they call it the Brothers' War, which I never realized. I mean, you literally had brothers who were one fighting on one side, one fighting on the other, and and then there were even people that were like, they were unionists but they were pro-slavery, and I'm like, what? But it's just interesting how history gets sort of simplified over time, and we just don't realize. And even when Virginia seceded, a lot of the people who voted to secede, they only did it because they were threatened. Like literally, people were like, if you don't vote for this, your blood is going to run in the streets. So people voted for it, and they didn't want to vote for it, and like the people in Western Virginia, they were crying, because they were the mountain people. They didn't even have slaves. They didn't believe in slavery. And that's when West Virginia seceded from Virginia, and then they joined the Union as West Virginia. But just the image of them voting to leave the Union, and all these delegates from Western Virginia just sitting there like weeping, is just like, it's wild, it's just everything's more complicated than it looks. It's just everything's not, black and white. Just even some of these slave laws that they had in Virginia too are just amazing. Like if you freed, so like Elizabeth Van Lew had these slaves, but she could free them, but if she did free them, they had to leave Virginia within a year. They could not return. So these people didn't want to leave everything they knew and all their family and all their friends. So basically, she would keep them on the books as slaves, but she would treat them as if they were free. And they were allowed to, she would write a pass for them for a month. They could live elsewhere, they could take jobs, or if they wanted to stay and work for her, she would pay them a normal wage. So she treated them as if they were free. But on the books, they weren't free because they would have had to leave Virginia. And if they stayed past that 1 year, they could get arrested and you'd be sold downriver. So, and one of her, slaves, this is very complicated, but this woman, she sent north to be educated in Philadelphia. And it was against the law for that young woman to come back to Virginia, because if you sent a slave outside of the state to get an education, they were not allowed to return ever. So
illegal to teach slaves to read at the time, wasn't it?
Yes, yeah.
So let alone a whole education, just the reading alone we're already in trouble.
Right. And then that was at the time too that, the American Colonization Society in Liberia was going on. So this woman was in Elizabeth Van Lew's home, obviously she treats her slaves very well. She treats them as if they're free. But then there's this woman in her home. Her name is Mary Jane Richards. She becomes Mary Jane Bowser. But she's sent up north to go to school. She goes to Liberia for 5 years and is a missionary over there. And I kept racking my brains and I was like, why is she being treated differently than the other, slaves in the household? And then I met a national park ranger here in Richmond. His name is Nathan Hall, and he's working on a book on Elizabeth Van Lew. So he was saying that based on his research, he thinks that this woman, Mary Jane Richards, she was half white, half black, and that her mother was white, and that she was a distant cousin of the Van Lews, and she was impregnated by a black enslaved person. So that was incredibly taboo, and that they basically at birth took this baby and gave the baby to Elizabeth Van Lew and her mother to raise. So that this Mary Jane Richards was a relative of the Van Lews, and that's why she was treated better than the other enslaved people in their household. Does that make sense?
No, but it makes, I'm following the narrative.
Of course it doesn't make sense, but yeah. But so that's because I was like, just writing this book has just been, I'm like, this is all so complicated. And I was like, why is one person getting sent, up north to Philadelphia and the other ones aren't being sent? And then once I realized, okay, that makes sense. But it's important to kind of understand this Mary Jane Richards, because she becomes part of the spy ring with Elizabeth Van Lew, and she ends up becoming being employed at the Confederate White House by Jefferson Davis. And she was brilliant, and she had this photographic memory, and she was able to look at documents and memorize them. And then she would give all the information to Elizabeth Van Lew, and they would send it up north to Grant. So she ended up being part of this, a vital part of the spy ring. But of course, with all this history, once you get going, it's, then there's people that say that this is, that's made up of Elizabeth Richards really being in the Confederate White House and blah, 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 blah. But that's what is nice about saying it, being able to write it under fiction and saying, okay, this is too great of a plot twist to have Mary Jane Bowser in the Confederate White House, memorizing these documents that I can put an author's note at the end and say, it's debatable whether or not this is all actually true. I mean, basically, there's only one thing that Mary Jane Richards wrote in one letter. She said that she was in there as like a laundress or something like that. So, but that's what's fun about fiction, is you can say, okay, I'm going to go with it because, so there was like this whole, one of the members of the ring was a Scottish man who ran a bakery. So he would make deliveries to the Confederate White House, and then he would be able to get, relay information to and from, and would report to Elizabeth Van Lew. And there was another German man, he had a German restaurant. And then there were some unionist politicians. And then there were enslaved people who would deliver a lot of the messages because they wouldn't really be noticed, whereas the, white people would be noticed. So she also helped orchestrate a big prison escape out of what's known as called Libby Prison. So that was a famous escape that her spiring coordinated. So yeah, she's amazing. I mean, that woman just really, her moral fiber and strength to persevere through all that is just incredible.
So how are you going to go about taking all this raw data that you're collecting, and sounds like you're going to go on collecting? What's that process going to be like over the next couple of years of converting all of this excitement and passion into a book that people can hold in their hands?
Oh, that's a great question. I just basically take a lot of notes, and oh my gosh, I've got books everywhere with, tags in them. But I try to basically just really keep a huge, just a Word document and try to take notes in there. And then when I start, say I'm working on Fort Sumter, then I can just do a search for Fort Sumter and then kind of pull all those notes together. And then I just kind of will organize my notes, and then I just start really like hammering away little by little. But part of it too is developing the characters, because the facts can be interesting, but if you don't have your characters developed, it's not as engrossing. So so I've got the first few chapters done, and I have a good friend from college who we've been working together for now about 3 years. She lives in Kansas City, and I have a deal where every other Friday we submit. We call it submission time, and we have to email each other a chapter, and then we'll edit the other, I'll edit my friend's chapter, she'll edit mine, and then we email it back, and then we'll talk on the phone like the following Wednesday for an hour, and we'll talk through hers for half an hour, then we talk through mine, and then we set another submission date. So that's been the hugest help, because it keeps me on a schedule of like, oh my gosh, like this Friday, I've got to submit something to Anne, and I've got to, what am I going to submit to her? And sometimes, it's like Tuesday by the time we submit to each other because we're working on it. But that's just been such a godsend, because it's so easy to just keep skipping around and really not getting anywhere. So that's really that's really what keeps me grounded. But I don't know. I just kind of keep going through it and going, like, sifting through it. And sometimes I know the best thing I can do is to just sort of leave where, like, I've been working on the Fort Sumter, the secession convention, and actually Mary Jane Richards gets married at the very beginning. She gets married at St. John's Church. So I've got like all that there, but I've kind of worked on it so much now that I'm like, okay, I just need to let it sit and percolate and don't look at it for a month, and then I'll kind of circle back and all that. And what I'm trying to do too is learn about the spy ring and all the characters, because what I'd like to do is kind of pepper them in at the beginning of her seeing them in the crowd, or that they come to the wedding, and so that later on when they become part of the spy ring, people are like, oh, I remember that Scottish baker from the beginning. He's the one that brought the scones for the wedding, and that kind of thing. Kind of just laying sort of the trail of crumbs of trying to mention these people, so that later on when they're become a fuller character in the book, that people recognize the name. So I just kind of plug away, and there's probably more efficient ways to do it. And, but I just sort of just keep plugging away, and I keep, I've got all kinds of, like right here, I've got, this is like the Bible. It's called Southern Lady Yankee Spy by Elizabeth Barron, which is really great. And then I just found this book the other day. This is about this man, Lohman. He's the German man that had the restaurant. And because, I met the caretaker at the cemetery the other day, and he knew a ton about the whole spy ring. So he had recommended this. So I found this. So I'm reading through that. So I just tend to I just keep reading and reading. And then I end up, I'll reread it, and it eventually it synthesizes into something. And then by the end of the book too, I'll have like a bunch of facts that I kind of want to weave in that, I just kind of leave them there because they're facts that I want to have in there, but I haven't found a home for them yet. So I just kind of keep looking at that too, of trying to figure out, okay, what do I want? Where do I want, can I fit this in? And, sometimes there isn't, most of the time I can find a little way to get the fact in, but, so I don't know. It's just, writing is so personal. It's like some people have these long, 20-page outlines in detail. And I wish I was one of those people, but I'm really not. It's just not the way my brain works.
When we're talking about characters, I mean, these are characters because they're in your fictional book, but they live. There's facts about them. And of course, when you're looking at someone's entire life, because the endings for all of these when they themselves do not.
Yes.
And I assume that these people are changing, some of them changing and evolving,
Right.
always for the better. But, over the course of a human life, if you're the same person when you walk out of this world as you were when you came in, there'll be some things that are same. But if you didn't evolve or grow, what did you do the whole time you were here? So how do you go about creating these characters so that they serve your purposes within your narrative while still preserving our best guess about who they would have been, and not just who they were overall, but who they were in that particular moment before whatever events is going to come to change them?
That's a great question. And, with my first book, writing about Susanna Bolling, a 16-year-old girl, that was a real, I wrote that as a real coming of age of kind of, her hubris of, she wants to be out on the battlefield. She wants to, get all these accolades from General Washington and all that kind of stuff. And then her arriving at humility by the end and realizing so many other people have contributed more to the war than she did. And that she doesn't need that it's a team effort. And then with Dolly, I tried to portray her as being, a little bit nervous and a little bit intimidated by husband's intelligence, and then really coming into her own. And, but I feel like the character arc needs to be a lot bigger when you're dealing with like a girl as opposed to an adult who's already grown, that it isn't, the coming of age is usually, geared to a younger person. But that's a good reminder of the, I'm writing it, and I'm writing it with, I'm writing it now as if Elizabeth Van Lew is determined, and I really probably should be having a lot more of her being a little nervous. She was always known for being very outspoken, but I should have it that she is nervous about really coming forward and show her resolve. And if she decides, I'm just going to go for it, I don't care what people think, I've got to go with my conscience. And her Elizabeth Van Lew's grandfather was the founder of the Philadelphia Abolition Society, and her grandfather's sister, so her great aunt, was a big nurse during the Revolutionary War. So I think a lot of her motivation was honoring her ancestors, of living up to her grandfather, and he was mayor of Philadelphia also. So, but yeah, I think that's a good point, is I should probably introduce kind of a little bit more nervousness and wavering on her part, and then her just doubling down of just like, this is wrong, and this is just something I have to do, or I'm not going to be able to sleep at night. And I do think is what happened. She kept a journal on her night table where she would write things, but she kept it on her night table so that if she, the police came and arrested her in the middle of the night for being a spy, that she could destroy her journal. And then she also buried parts of it in her backyard that were dug up later on. But a lot of the, there's definitely parts of her journal that are missing, but there's a lot that's still there. So it's neat to actually be able to write her own words. But I think,
would have inspired her to keep a journal, knowing that could have unraveled so much were it discovered. I mean, why is she keeping notes on a criminal conspiracy?
Right. But I think it also goes to like, even this woman was tough as nails, but like even she was human. And it was like, that's what I was kind of writing the other day of her, like, this is my one friend that I can trust is my journal, because you have to be so careful about what you were saying and what you were doing that, even she needed an outlet to get her feelings down of the being a social. I mean, this woman had like John Marshall in her house. She had Edgar Allan Poe reading The Raven in her parlor. I mean, they were the height of Richmond society with the Lees and the Cabells and the Carringtons and all that. And then, during the Civil War, she's completely cut off from society. And, the basic, all of us have our limits of the pain that would cause. So yeah, it really wasn't wise of her, but it does show that even she needed some sort of reassurance, even if it was the reassurance she was giving herself by keeping her journal. But
I think she maybe had an idea that someday someone will read this and they'll know that I existed. This is something I also did.
Yeah, I that's a good point for posterity, but gosh, it just must have been hard to imagine when really the whole town is turned. I mean, people were threatening to burn her house down. I mean, people were threatening her all the time. And but I don't know. I mean, yeah, I hopefully she did. I mean, she definitely thought she was on the right side of history. And, I mean, there's quotes in her journal of like, forgive them, they know not what they do. And just her despair was just is just heartbreaking. But what's interesting is a lot of people who felt that way moved north, and she didn't, because she felt like she could affect change being in Virginia. She also felt like she didn't want to abandon her slaves there either, and wanted to stay and take care of them and take care of the people. But what's interesting also, when we were talking earlier about the blurred lines of things, is she wasn't an abolitionist. She thought abolitionists were crazy before the war. Like, she thought they were total extremists, just as extreme as the fire eaters, they called the people down in the deep South. And she wanted to work this. She wanted to change the system from within by providing a good example of, oh, look at this woman, she treats her slaves so well, blah, blah, blah. She lets them live out and take on jobs, she pays them, and trying to basically erode the system over time, gently, without all this upheaval. And so that's what's interesting, because people love to say she was an abolitionist, and it's like, she actually really wasn't. She thought that was too extreme. And but obviously it didn't work, of this kind of notion of lead by example, and hopefully slavery will come to an end on its own. And obviously it didn't happen, but just how we tend to look at things with these rose-colored glasses of being an abolitionist. And even this woman with these strong beliefs thought those people were fanatics.
When you're dealing with these type of characters, these slaveholders or whoever, is it important for you? How do you establish empathy so that you can write about them and remove judgment? Because of course we're living in a later time where things have a long way to go, but have progressed significantly from where you're dealing with and where your characters are living. How can you separate your modern judgment away from those old values, or can you?
I guess it's hard to separate, what we just, feel so deep in our soul is, this is so wrong. But it's interesting to just to hear their mindset. I mean, it's sickening. I mean, they call slavery a Christianizing institution, and these people are inferior, and they can't, we're helping them, and they can't provide for themselves. And I mean, like I have a whole section of slavery of like all these kind of comments, so that I can kind of weave those in of people. But what I like to do, and what you know, people say is the key to good writing is showing, not telling, so that you're showing these people saying, showing them saying these, you know, horrible, you know, bigoted, racist, prejudicial comments, and letting the reader decide, oh my gosh, this person is awful. So I'm not saying they're awful. I'm just saying this is what they said. You make up your mind what you think. And, you know, but I'm wanting the reader to say, oh my gosh, this is awful. How do they think that way? But, you know, it's just a much more effective way of saying someone's nice or someone's mean. Showing them being nice and showing them being mean, you know, is you know, carries so much more impact with the reader. So that's why, like, I like this character, Mary, Elizabeth's sister-in-law. I really want to just show her, have her talking. And that's just how she was raised. That's the world she knows. And some of these other people, I mean, when Virginia seceded from the reunion, there were all these Richmond society ladies outside on Capitol Square with champagne, toasting. I mean, it's amazing. I mean, they had no idea what they were doing. You know, these people were, you know, there were parades through the streets of Richmond that went on like 24 hours a day, with people with torches and singing Dixie, and bands singing La Marseillaise, and just the revelry was like unbelievable. Like, people closed their shops because everyone was just out in the streets celebrating. And, you know, there were fireworks at night. There were, I mean, and then, you know, Richmond became like an armed camp with all these soldiers flooding in from all over the place, as, you know, when Richmond became the capital of the Confederacy. But I just kind of want people to have the same reaction that I do reading this stuff, of just like, oh my gosh, you know, just these people had no idea what they were doing, and just how deluded they were. And, you know, they thought, you know, they're yelling things like, oh, we're going to march into Washington City and we're going to kick Lincoln out of the White House. And I mean, you know, it's just like, oh my gosh, that happened right here. And
just thank goodness modern Americans would never try to storm the Capitol and create trouble.
Yeah, never put a you know, what, a Viking helmet on. And
no, goodness no. We are modern civilized people. We would never do such a thing.
Well, you just realize though that people are people, and just how people, you know, the herd mentality of, you know, people, you know, Virginia had just voted within 2 weeks before by a 2-to-1 margin not to secede from the Union. And then when Fort Sumter happened, and then Lincoln called up the troops, and then all this furor started, and these secessionists were great agitators. And that's a line I'm stealing from a book, but they were able to just gin up the crowd, and they controlled the media. And then also they tried to work on the women, that the patriotic women were the ones who wanted to leave the Union. So they got the women on their side, and, you know, the women were walking around with these like palmetto leaves to symbolize South Carolina. And, you know, every day of like, oh, I hope we're going out of the Union today. I can't live another day. And, you know, then they started making, you know, uniforms and all these, you know, things, but just kind of trying to get, you know, getting the support of the women was a big thing, but just playing on people's emotions. I mean, it was just a very volatile time, with people were just infuriated that Lincoln was calling up Virginia troops that he wanted to send down to South Carolina to put down the rebellion. And they were basically like, if we're going to be firing our weapons at anyone, we'd rather fire them at the North than fire them at our Southern brethren. And so, you know, who knows what would have happened if you know, if Fort Sumter hadn't happened. I mean, we'll never really know, but that was really the thing that blew everything apart. But at the time of Fort Sumter, there were already, I think it was either 6 or 7 states had withdrawn from the Union. And then after Fort Sumter, the border states, you know, the other 7 withdrew. But, you know, so it's like the Confederate States of America were not formed overnight. It took like, you know, it was months. Whereas I kind of thought it was they all withdrew, and, you know, and it just wasn't, once again, it wasn't clear cut, you know, at all.
Well, they're dealing about letters on horseback. Nobody's emailing anybody to make things happen immediately.
Well, yeah, this, and that's what's neat too, is realizing like they had the telegrams back then. So things would go by telegraph, and then the telegraph would go from like one station to the next station, and then it would get relayed from that station. So it would take like, 2 or 3 hours to get a telegram. But, that was like revolutionary. But like even with Fort Sumter happening, it was interesting because Richmond had just had these horrific rains and they had no contact with the outside world because the whole telegraph, they weren't able to receive telegraph. So people were just really freaking out, wondering, what's going on and all that. So that's what's kind of neat too, is just even finding out what the weather was like back then and what, what the circumstances were. So people were even, extra like ginned up because they were cut off from communication, and just, the whole city just exploded when they got these telegrams about Fort Sumter surrendering, and people had Confederate flags, all, every house had a Confederate flag in front of it. And meanwhile, Elizabeth Van Lew had this huge American flag in front of her house that she eventually had to take down for really her own safety. But she was the first person to put up a General Grant sent her a flag, and she was the first person to hang an American flag after the Richmond fell. So, and another neat fact was that because Jefferson Davis set fire to the Richmond when he left, when he fled, he wanted to set like Tredegar Ironworks and all the important places on fire so the Union wouldn't have control of them. But then the fire spread, and it was basically black Union troops who were the first ones to come in, who came and put out the fires. So there's some certain irony there. But yeah, so the Union troops were like, they were the ones who put out the fires. I mean, that's just amazing. So much of it, and they were trying to burn all the records and everything on their way out the door. But
so if I've got a time machine and I could say to you, Libby, you can't go to the future, but you can go anytime in America's past. You pick the nice, calm Goldilocks zone where it's going to be great. Everybody's getting along. Where are you going?
oh gosh, if I could pick one time, I actually would love to go to the one of Dolley Madison's squeezes. That's what I would love to go back to War of 1812 and be at one of Dolley Madison's parties. I think that would be really awesome, just to see all those political figures in one room, all interacting with each other, and to actually meet Dolley, I think would be really awesome. That would be very fun. I'll have to try to think about that tonight when I fall asleep, so that maybe I have a dream that I'm at a one of Dolley's squeezes. But it would be neat though to see Richmond during the Civil War. I mean, the suffering in Richmond was amazing because the population exploded, like quadruple, because all of a sudden it was a capital, it was the capital city of the Confederacy. And then all the war, so many of the battles were fought right around Richmond that all the prisoners of war were brought there. And then all the wounded on both sides were brought there. Basically, like everybody's house in Richmond turned into like a hospital caring for an injured soldier. And, the inflation was like 700%. And I mean, there was a blockade all the way down the East Coast, and it went all the way up the Mississippi around the South. So, I mean, people were starving, and in Richmond in particular, and housing was so short that, and the Confederacy didn't have any money or time to make any more buildings, to build anything. They were trying to, build things for the military. So people couldn't even find anywhere to rent. It got to the point where you could rent like the floor in their parlor from like 8 o'clock at night till 6 in the morning. And that was, and then it was incredibly expensive because the housing was so limited, and for the amount of people that were flooding in. And then there were a lot of people who were flooding in because they felt safer there, that they were better protected than, there were people who had like both armies trudging across their fields having battles. I mean, it literally happened. So there were, people flooding in from all over the place for a multitude of different reasons. And some people were even bringing in there, and they were bringing their slaves in there to kind of keep the slaves, in check, so that one of the, the Union Army wouldn't come through and take off with them. People were so thrilled that Richmond was going to be the capital of the Confederacy, and they really had no idea what they were signing up for, because it just made Richmond a huge target. And then the city ended up in ashes by the end. And I mean, at that point, Richmond was the most industrialized city in the South. And then it's really never recovered. I mean, it's not any, it's Atlanta's a much bigger city. Charlotte, Richmond has never really totally recovered from the Civil War.
I think I find it a little bit difficult to summon the sympathy for the poor folks who couldn't keep their slaves in check. Well, here's the world's smallest island.
Yes, I hear you. It's just interesting of just we are all a product of our past. And people, Civil War is very taboo now. People don't even like to talk about it, but it's we're not going to learn from it if we don't talk about it. And there's a lot of nuances out there, but it's every place is a product of its history. So, I mean, look at Atlanta. It's like so much of it was burned down. Everything there is new. There's really nothing old there. But ignoring the past doesn't make it go away. So, we need to honor the people that suffered so much. And this cemetery that I was at the other day, it's in a rough part of town, and they built 95, Interstate 95, and it went right over an African burial ground. I mean, it's just awful, just absolutely horrible. Because this area of Richmond, it used to, it's called Jackson Ward. It used to be known as the Harlem of the South. And they put 95 right through the middle of it. So, I mean, the area is still there, but it's never going to be the same as what it was when they, put 95 going right through the middle of it. But it's just good for us all to learn from all this. And
That tempers the view of the modern world a little bit, I think, because if you've been running, if you're like me, esteemed audience, and you ran around a little bit during the pandemic, and certainly during our new neighbor Mike Pence's time in the White House, if you were running around a little bit like, oh my God, everything is on fire, this is just madness. Well, a nice thing about going back and reading our history is like, no, it's frequently been on fire.
Yeah.
A lot of madness that continues. I don't know if that's comforting, but at least gives you some context for what's going on. Yeah.
Right. No, but I do find it really comforting to realize of these contentious times, and that we had a civil war going on for 5 years, and we got through that. So I do think it's comforting, and realizing that these, we like to think, oh, everything was all peaceful, and it's like not everyone was a patriot during the Revolutionary War. 1/3 of the people were loyalists, another third were undecided, and the other third were patriots. So, we try to, simplify history, but there's always going to be just a widespread, diaspora of views, all over the spectrum. So, War of 1812 of the Federalists and the Republicans, I mean, they couldn't have been more different in their views, and they had their reasons. I mean, the Federalists were for a strong federal government, like George Washington, like Alexander Hamilton and John Adams. And they wanted a standing army. They wanted a federal bank. And, turned out they were right. I mean, Madison, after the War of 1812, he was like, okay, I understand why these call-up militias are not good enough. And that's one of the great things about Madison, is I felt like he's teachable. He learned, and his views would evolve. And realizing you can't fight a war without a federal bank and a standing army, especially against the greatest military power in the world. So Jefferson just had a much more view of these agrarian farmers and all that. But, but the Federalists, they were all in the shipping industry. So Jefferson had wanted to put in, and Madison, as the Secretary of State, wanted to put in these embargoes on trade with Great Britain before the War of 1812. And the embargoes ended up really only destroying the economy in the Northeast, where the Federalists were. So the Federalists were justifiably angry of like, this embargo isn't even working, and it's hurting us, and it's not hurting you. So, I mean, I definitely feel for the Federalists and thought they had every right to be as angry as they were. So that's kind of interesting too. It's when you stop looking at who your team is, if you're team Jefferson or team, Hamilton, and you actually look at what the actual issues are and realizing, okay, well, maybe I probably would have been more of a Federalist at the time, but also they just didn't know what we know then. They just, like my son's a huge history buff, and he was saying that in the Articles of Confederation that were so loosey-goosey that he was just saying that people thought that the Articles of Confederation were asking for too much because people really wanted all the power to remain with the states. So, and then, with the Constitution, it's, it amped it up so much that the Articles of Confederation were too loose and that we needed the Constitution. So, that's the thing I try to remind myself of, like I said, if our country started 20 years ago in 2002, when we were, Friends was our favorite show, like that we don't, we didn't have that experience to look back on, to learn from, that we do, that we can look back, with our kind of critical gaze and have a different perspective that they just didn't have open to them because they were living through the times, not looking back on them.
Something that was Dan Carlin, I'm sure he was repeating somebody else on his show, Hardcore History, which I never get tired of recommending other podcasts that people could be listening to instead of this one, but I'm a fan of Hardcore History, and something he said.
I'm gonna have to write that down.
I believe it was the ancient Greeks, he did an episode, and he was talking about, now you need to remember that for these people, magic was real, and it had never occurred to before. Oh yeah, nobody's Googling this. Nobody has the definitive information. Most of the people are illiterate. The people in power say magic is real. They keep hearing tales that magical acts were performed here. I'm sure, of course, there's some David Copperfield trickery going on that convinces them that magic's happening right there. But if they're saying that we're about to fight a witch, they're really thinking they're about to fight a witch, or they're fighting a wizard, or whoever the villain is, because magic's really. So thinking about our own history, nobody's got the internet, nobody has the future in mind of how this is all going to turn out, nor do we currently. It does put a nice perspective on there of how limited their perspectives might have been in some ways, and how little information they would have had, and how easy it is to take for granted how much information that we have now, so much so that people say, well, I don't need to know it, it'll be here in the cloud for me later.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's like back then a cloud was just a cloud. But yeah, just even, being able to transmit information too, or receiving information, because the Battle of New Orleans happened on January 8th of 1815. And it took forever, it took about a month basically to get word up from there about the, miraculous victory there. And because there were no roads and all of that, but also there was there had been a blizzard that had struck Washington City. Washington City had an epidemic of, they call it it was called putrid sore throat. So that's January 8th. They get the word back, 3 weeks to a month later. They're celebrating in the streets, for weeks, women out there with pots and pans. Dolly's got candles lit in every window of the Octagon House, and nonstop celebration. And then basically once the celebrations stop, all of a sudden, someone comes back from the delegation over in Bruges, Belgium, with a treaty. And the treaty had been signed on December 24th, 1814. So this was before the Battle of New Orleans. So technically the Battle of New Orleans did not need to have been fought at all because the war was ended. But because of, the challenges of getting word, but also it was definitely in our best interest that we did have the Battle of New Orleans, because it's what really made people feel like we won the war, even though the terms of the treaty were very weak. It was, all it did was restore the status quo. It didn't even touch on impressment, which wasn't an issue anymore because Napoleon had been defeated. So the British didn't need to oppress our sailors anymore, but it wasn't even mentioned in the agreement. But the perception of people was that we won the war after the Battle of New Orleans. But yeah, it's just pretty crazy when you think about the lack of communication. It's amazing, really. Anything got done.
What a terrible, if you're somebody who was wounded or lost people in the war and you find out later, oh, it didn't even need to happen. Oh,
right.
That's not a good day. I'm watching our time, and it's flown right by, as it always does, in a great conversation. Before we call it a day, I did want to ask about something on your website, and that
Sure.
is that you're offering author consultations.
Yes.
So I want to make sure I ask just to give us a little taste for what you can share with us on a podcast for free. What could people look forward to receiving if they were to sign up for one of those consultations?
Oh, that's a great question. Thank you. Really anything. I'm a self-published author, so I went through it, and it is like, and now I understand what people talk about with tearing their hair out. There were times where I was really ready to tear my hair out, and how frustrating it can be. And if you Google self-publish in, online, you're going to get like, 2 million hits. I mean, there's just a million people out there who are ready to take your money, and it's hard to know what to do and what's worth the money and what isn't. So that's why I really want to leave it open-ended. If people are trying to decide, well, do I want to do a hybrid publisher? Do I want to try to get an agent? Do I want to, or I am self-publishing, but I'm stuck on this, and who should I use for an editor, and how should I do the cover, or how do I set this up, or who do you use for formatting? And I do a lot of this, a lot with people that I'll meet at a talk, or I'll meet through someone or a friend of a friend. And I've found I spend hours and hours and hours and hours helping people, and I like doing that. But I've finally gotten to the point where I'm like, it would be nice to be compensated somewhat for some of my time, because I could lose the whole afternoon of my own writing time. And I feel like sometimes some of the advice people have given me, it was worth $500. Like, sometimes what someone can just tell you will save you like months of research where you wouldn't even find the answer on the internet. So I kind of just put that out there as an open thing, and happy to tailor it to whatever someone is looking for. But, I've been through the process twice, and also marketing. A lot of people approach me with asking for help with marketing, and I'd be happy to help someone come up with a marketing plan of what kind of, bookstores do you want to try to get your book into, and approaching different groups to become a speaker, and all of that, because it really is. I mean, it's kind of overwhelming of how many different avenues you can take. So I'm kind of experimenting with it and seeing, but I would be very open to tailoring it to whatever help someone is looking for. And I'm happy to even do editing as well. So I actually just put that on my website just probably within the last month of putting that out there, because I love helping people, and so many people have helped me along the way, and I will forever be grateful for that. So, but I realized too, is the information that I know now, I would have paid a ton of money for it. If I could have sat down and paid someone a few $100s, and all the heartache it would have helped me. Even setting up setting up a small business is like, I was a French major. I mean, international relations, like, I've never run a small business. And there's so many things now that I wish someone had told me at the very beginning of like, just, keep a list of, every time you send books to like Mount Vernon. And like, now I need to go back and I need to go all the way back to the beginning and realize, because I'd love to be able to say, oh, I've sold 500 books to Mount Vernon, but I didn't keep records of that from the beginning, and just all sorts of things. There's just so many different aspects of it. And so many things that I've just learned the hard way that I'd be happy to save someone else some heartache. And, when it doesn't have to be, but, writing can be very solitary, and it's, sometimes it's just nice to have like a mentor out there, somebody rooting for you, that that it can be done, and someone actually has crossed the finish line and give you some tips, so it's not quite as painful getting there.
You can also start a podcast, and you'd be amazed at the incredible people that will come and offer you advice for no compensation whatsoever. As far as marketing goes, I saw that your events page for this year is just, your dance card is very full. You're constantly out and about and speaking. I'm sure that was curtailed a bit during the quarantine, but hopefully now that we're approaching the endemic stage, whenever that officially becomes the declaration or ahead of the new variant, whatever is happening in the future,
Yeah.
all of this will age badly by the time this airs. It always does when we talk about the pandemic. But as far as going forward, how are you getting all of those events booked and planned? Are you doing that on your own? Do you have a publicist that helps you with that?
No, I say it's like the Wizard of Oz. You pull back the curtain and it's just me. So I do all of it. So I'm still small, it's I'm not really making enough money to hire someone else, and I'm not and a lot of ways sometimes it's just easier to just do it yourself, and it's done, and I want to have my emails have the right tone, and I want to that people have said, oh, you should hire someone, and I just I just keep a lot of notes and got a lot of sticky pages, but it's cultivating relationships and meeting people and following up, and and then finding just finding neat people on Instagram and trying to connect and all that. But I try to keep my my website updated with all my events, so that I kind of use it myself as like making sure, okay, I have this at this time, and so the minute I book something, I put it on there. So because it's easy to lose control of all the details, because each gig is a separate email chain and a separate whole separate story. So it's just trying to be organized to keep on top of it, and then just kind of give myself a tickler to follow up with someone of, oh, I was going to hear from them in February, I haven't heard from them, I'll send them an email and see if they want to set something up. But yeah, the pandemic definitely put the kibosh on a lot of things, especially the school visits, which is a bummer, because I love it all, but I love doing the school visits. So it seems to be picking back up. So I'm looking forward to that. And I like doing the Zoom school visits. That's a lot of fun. I just had one a couple of weeks ago with a group in California. So that was really fun. So yeah, I speak at retirement homes, historical societies, museums, schools, anybody who wants to listen to me talk, I'm there. I love it. So it's because I'm more of an extrovert, so sitting home all day long every single day gets old. Writing, I mean, I enjoy that, but it's nice to get out and do book signings and all that.
Well, presumably once you've gone someplace and you've given an amazing presentation, they're going to refer you to other places, and that will help keep the ball rolling. Yeah.
Right. That definitely helps, is getting out there and meeting people, and each person you meet, refer, or, like I do I get a table at Berkeley Plantation here in Virginia. They have a first Thanksgiving, that was the first Thanksgiving in America. So they have a first Thanksgiving celebration in November. And that's great. I always just meet so many interesting history nerds like myself. So like I met someone from the Sons of the American Revolution. So I'm speaking to his group in a couple of weeks, but I met him at that. So it is good. Every time I going out to an event, you just meet other people. And then I'll try to find Facebook groups. Like lately I've been trying to find homeschool groups on Facebook, and just trying to kind of be out there and receptive. And then every once in a while yesterday I got an email from a woman in Nashville, and she just found my book online and liked it and wanted to have me do a Zoom talk with her class. So like that's an awesome feeling when I actually didn't even do anything and someone has found me. So that's really neat. So it, it comes in fits and starts. Sometimes I feel like, oh my gosh, there's nothing going on. And then sometimes, I'm getting all these emails, and, so it's kind of cyclical.
Never finds a nice even steady, at least my inbox never does.
Yeah.
Just crickets, or everybody in the world suddenly needs something right this minute.
Right. It is funny. Yeah, definitely. But it's also too, once when I first published my first book, this was 3.5 years ago, I went into, there's a really neat Richmond history museum called the Valentine. And I went in there, and they bought some books, and then, and I had also gone to St. John's Church, and they said, oh, well, right now we're not in a buying mode. We're, the time of year we're not buying books right now, blah, blah, blah. And I said, okay. And then they emailed me a few days later, and they said, oh, somebody from our office was at the Valentine and they saw your book there, and now we want it. So we're gonna, we do want to buy books. So that's the thing, is once you get in one place, like when I tell people, okay, my books are at Mount Vernon, my books are at Colonial Williamsburg, or, they're at Poplar Forest, or, St. John's Church, then people think, oh, okay, it's been vetted. So that's, it kind of, that makes it easier too. The more, it kind of, creates its own momentum too. The hardest part is really getting started. But, so, but I've realized, like with the Susanna book, it's been more popular with schools. Of course, the pandemic is, creates its own issues, but because it's a Revolutionary War book, and most schools don't read or don't study the War of 1812, which I think, now I think that we should, but, so that's kind of been one where, like at the retirement homes, when I send them an email and I'll say, oh, I've got to talk on Dolley Madison, I've got one on Susanna Bolling, and they're like, oh, Dolley Madison, because they know who she is. Like the older crowd really likes her. So so that's neat. It's just got different different audiences, and the Dolley Madison ties in with like the First Ladies Museum. Like they're supposed to reopen this spring, and they said they were going to carry it and have me do like a virtual event with them. So that would be neat. So that's kind of neat. And I've got it in, the Dolley Madison book is at the George W. Bush Presidential Museum, and the other George H.W., if they're looking at it. And I've emailed a bunch of others. So that's the thing, is you kind of just send out the emails, and then if you hear back, you hear back. And if you don't, you don't, but at least you tried.
You have like a set list every day of, I need to send out this many emails or this week, or is it just in batches where I feel inspired to see how many people I can reach out to today?
Yeah, I just get certain, like yesterday I did a lot of emailing and that kind of things, because sometimes I'm just like, it's just hard to keep, pushing and pushing and pushing. And so I go through kind of, different days where I feel like motivated and it's fun. And then you can kind of cut and paste, and it is easier to do a whole bunch at once. And then like I went through all the presidential museums, and I'm like, okay, let me do this. Or like I'll do research, like, okay, what are the, 10 biggest retirement homes in, Virginia? And then I'll go through all that, and then I'll email all of them and just kind of throw it out there and see who I hear back from, and kind of do it all at once. But because after a while it gets kind of tedious, just the emails and stuff like that. So I try to mix it up, like do the writing for a few hours and then do that when I'm kind of a little more mindless, as a way to take a break. And then, so it's sometimes you hear right back, and sometimes somewhere you think you're going to hear back from, you never hear back from. So you just never know. It's I just
Anytime
think,
anyone's waiting, if you're listening to this and wondering when is Rob going to reply to my email, my inbox fills up and I pick about 2 days a week and it's like, all right,
yeah,
I've done all my writing for the day. For the next 30 minutes, nothing but clearing out these emails that have accumulated. And so 5 days later, you might get a response from me. It's not because I wasn't in a hurry to talk to you.
right.
Stuff I had to do.
Well, yeah, but it's also, the whole batching concept is it's so much more time effective than like, stopping what you're doing to answer one email. And, I mean, it's,
Yeah,
because
no fiction will never get written, right?
yeah, you'd never get it. Yeah, you'd never get anything done. Yeah. So you kind of have to like unplug but it is tempting though. You hear the little ding and all that stuff. But it is nice. Like once I get into the researching and all that, it's kind of neat where I'm like, oh, 3 hours went by and it just flew, so that's neat. So I kind of go with like whatever my muse is for the day of feeling, whatever I feel inspired, but I definitely go through times where I'm just like, oh, I just can't send another email. And, just kind of, it's hard to keep, plugging. So that's why it's just fun to have.
There might be some of my favorite people in the world waiting there in the inbox.
Right.
Not right now. We'll get to it.
Right. Yeah. And that's the thing too, is yeah, I don't mind that at all. I also feel like, okay, I know I tried and, instead of, I always like say to myself, it's better to have someone say no or not reply, than for me to say no to myself. Oh, I'm sure they wouldn't, blah, blah, blah. But it's like, okay, I tried. If I don't hear back, it took me 5 minutes and then I've done my part and it's, the universe can answer me, whether it's out there. And like stuff, I mean, I found stuff too, where there was a homeschool review and I just was looking through my Facebook emails and I realized that I was supposed to send this woman book like 6 months ago and I forgot. And I wrote back and I said, I'm so sorry. I just saw this. Can I send them to you now? And she was like, sure. And so it happens on both ends where it's hard when you've got that amount of traffic to keep up with everything. But that's why I've got all my scribbled little notes and everything. I feel like if I write it down, each day of like, I need to respond to this or send an invoice for that kind of thing. But yeah, there's always room for human error in everything.
I need to replay this part of the conversation for myself the next time I'm refreshing my inbox and thinking, why hasn't this person got back to me?
I know, you just never know, really. I mean, I had something the other day, it was so funny. Usually I have an event and I usually email like the morning of and say, okay, I'm coming. I mean, this was totally booked. It was Tuesday at 2:00. I had it all. I'd even given them a W-9. I'd given them an invoice. And then I emailed them last week. I was kind of on the ball last week. And then I didn't hear anything back. And then it was like, so then Tuesday morning I called and usually I would just kind of show up. It was like, oh, I mean, it turns out they were like, oh my gosh, we totally forgot about you. We double booked and we've got a George Washington interpreter coming at the same time. Can you just come another time? And I was like, okay, like, so, but then they've rescheduled and they're like, okay, we want you to come twice. We want to have you talk about each of your books. And, so it all worked out. I mean, but it was just kind of funny. Like, it just, things happen. So I had an afternoon to write that I didn't expect to have. So that worked out well, but yeah, it was just kind of funny, but it was just one of those where I was like thinking, why am I calling them? Usually I just, and it was like, I just had this feeling. I'm like, I just have a feeling about this one. And so, but you just got to be flexible with people. You just, it's just, things are going to happen. And I know when I've messed some things up too. So I'm always happy when someone shows me a little grace. So,
well, when you're dealing with book people, anything book related, 9 times out of 10, you're not dealing with somebody where that's their primary job.
right.
If I'm talking to a book publicist, they may have a day job while they're building their publicist relations on the side. Certainly literary agents, we've heard enough of them on the show talk about they're working the job that pays the rent and then doing the literary agenting on the top of it. And it's just, people get busy, people have lives. Yeah, show grace, I agree.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, so then it's always but a pleasant surprise when an email pops in your inbox, and so
You have been extremely generous with your time this afternoon, which I greatly appreciate. And I know
oh, likewise.
as well. We can't get out of here without me asking about flying saucers and ghosts, because I ask everybody about flying saucers and ghosts. Have you seen either of those?
I have not, but they do say that the ghost of Dolly Madison is in Washington City. In particular, they say at the White House and at the Octagon House. But she used to love this lilac perfume. She would wear this all the time. So they say if you're in Washington, D.C. and you catch a whiff of lilac, that means that the ghost of Dolly Madison is nearby.
You should leave a book out for her. And wouldn't that be so wonderful if the actual ghost of Dolly Madison could sit down and like, well, this is what you got wrong. I like this part.
Yeah.
More of that. Write another book and put more of this part of me in it.
Yes. Well, what's neat too is someone told me that Elizabeth Van Lew, her home was basically the grandest in Richmond, and it was torn down, and there's now an elementary school there. And someone told me, this woman who does tours, she's another history geek, she does historic tours in Richmond, ghost tours, and that apparently Elizabeth Van Lew haunts this elementary school, and that there'll be like a kindergartner who makes her way all the way down to the office of the school, and the woman in the office will say, well, how did you get here? And say, I don't know, this old lady helped me. I mean, she was kind of weird looking, but she was really nice, but she walked me down here. So that they say that Elizabeth Van Lew haunts the school in a good way.
Yeah, it sounds about like the most pleasant encounter you can have with a ghost if she just helps you find directions. Oh, great.
Right. Yes.
More of those, less of all other kinds of ghosts, I say.
Yes. Yeah. No, thankfully. But I do have a friend who I can even hook you up with her. She is a PhD now in paranormal, and she does all these historical she goes to these different historical sites and does paranormal research while she's there, and she's had some really disturbing encounters. I mean, she's had nice encounters, but she's had some scary encounters also. So I'll have to,
very fun.
Yeah, I'll have to hook you up with her. She's very interesting and knows a lot.
I love hearing other people having those encounters. Me, I'm going to stay here through the same podcast screen. But
I'm good. Yeah, she can have all those encounters she wants, and I'm happy to hear about them and read about them. But yeah.
Where can esteemed audience find you online, follow you on social media, and all that good stuff?
Let's see. Well, I am on Facebook, Libby McNamee author, and same on Instagram, Libby McNamee author. So it's McNamee is a hard one. It's McNamee. And I've also got a website at libbymcnamee.com. And I've got a monthly newsletter if anyone would like to sign up for that. So I've got historical tidbits. Last month, I did one on the George Washington's inoculation initiative during the Revolutionary War, inoculating soldiers for smallpox. So I do that, and I include like a historic recipe and try to make it interesting for history geeks, and it's not make it a big advertisement. So it's fun. I enjoy it. So if you'd like to sign up for that, that's on my website at libbymcnamee.com. So thank you very much, Rob. This was awesome. The time has flown.
Being a tremendous guest. You're going to keep writing, so eventually we'll have to get together and do this again.
That sounds great. And
as always, esteemed audience,
an 1812 gathering in somewhere in Indiana that maybe someday I'll head out there and go to that.
Oh, I'm sure we've got reenactments happening all over the place.
I think it's Marion, Indiana. I think where it is. It's like the largest reenactment, largest gathering.
No, we have a very large one there. I don't know if it's the largest.
Okay.
They've got, they've got cannons that they shoot off somehow safely. I never read about anybody getting hit by a stray cannonball. So they're
fingers crossed.
As always, esteemed audience, for interviews with thousands of literary agents, editors, authors, publishing professionals, all the world's best people, head to middlegradeninja.com. Download your free copy of Banneker Bones, the Giant Robot Bees. It will change your life. And God willing, I'm alive. I'll see you next week.